Elena Voss woke to the sound of boots on gravel outside the cabin window, and her heart slammed against her ribs before her eyes even opened. She sat up fast, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders, listening. 3 sets of footsteps, maybe 4, moving with purpose, not the lazy patrol of border guards but the sharp, deliberate steps of hunters who already knew what they were looking for. Damien was gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets barely holding the shape of him anymore. He had left before dawn, the way he always did when duty called him back to the capital, but this time something felt different. This time the air itself felt like it was holding its breath. Elena pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat, still hiding the secret that would change everything, and forced herself to breathe slowly. She had known this day might come. She had simply hoped for more time. The footsteps stopped outside the door. She grabbed her cloak from the chair, her boots from beside the bed, and moved without thinking toward the back window, the one she had left unlatched 3 weeks ago for exactly this reason. A voice outside called her name, not gently, not the way Damien said it, but the way a soldier says a name when he intends to drag its owner back to face judgment. The window slid open with a soft groan. Cold mountain air rushed in, biting against her skin, and Elena swung one leg over the sill just as the front door splintered inward. She did not look back. She dropped into the darkness below, landed hard on packed earth, and ran. Branches tore at her sleeves as she cut through the tree line behind the cabin, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts, the way her mother had taught her when she was young and still learning what it meant to be a wolf who could not always win by strength alone. Sometimes the only way to survive was to be faster, quieter, smarter than the ones chasing you. Behind her, she heard the guards spill out of the cabin, heard one of them shout an order to spread out, heard the unmistakable crack of a branch as something large and fast entered the woods. She did not need to look back to know what it was. Wolves in their shifted form moved through forest like water through stone, and if one of them caught her scent clearly, there would be no outrunning it on 2 legs. So Elena did the only thing she could. She let go. The shift came fast and painful, the way it always did when forced instead of chosen, bones bending and reshaping in seconds instead of the slow minutes a calm shift usually took. She stumbled once on 4 legs before finding her rhythm, and then she ran, low and silent, weaving between trunks older than the kingdom itself. She did not know why the guards had come for her that night. She did not know if someone had discovered her connection to Damien, or if this was simply the price paid by any wolf without pack protection, who lingered too long near royal land. What she did know, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, was that she could not be caught. Not now. Not with what she carried inside her. The chase lasted until the first gray light of morning touched the treetops. Elena crossed a shallow river twice to break her scent trail, doubled back through a ravine thick with thorn brush, and finally collapsed, human again, behind the crumbling wall of an abandoned watchtower, 2 territories away from the only home she had known. Her hands shook, her knees were raw and bleeding. But she was alive, and she was alone, and somewhere far behind her, the man she loved was walking toward a throne and a marriage that had nothing to do with her. She thought about going back. She thought about it every single day for the next 3 weeks, wondering if she should walk into the capital and tell Damien the truth before his coronation, before the elder council bound him to a bride chosen for politics instead of love. But every time she pictured it, she saw his face the morning he left, calm and distant, already halfway gone in his mind to the crown waiting for him. He had never once looked back at the cabin. Not once. A woman did not have to be foolish twice. Elena walked south instead, away from wolf territory entirely, into the scattered human towns where nobody asked questions about scent or rank or bloodline. She found work in a small diner in a place called Millbrook, wiping down tables and pouring coffee for truck drivers who never looked at her twice, and she told herself this was enough. This quiet, gray, ordinary life was enough. 6 weeks after she arrived in Millbrook, she stood in the cramped bathroom of the apartment above the diner, staring at a small plastic stick on the edge of the sink, and finally let herself cry. Not from fear this time, from something closer to grief, for the life she had imagined once, briefly, foolishly, before she understood that alpha kings did not choose diner waitresses to stand beside their thrones. She pressed both hands over her stomach, and made herself a promise instead of a plan. Whatever came next, this child would never grow up feeling like a secret to be ashamed of. This child would know love, even if it never knew its father's name. The pregnancy was not easy. Elena's body seemed to know, somehow, that it carried more than an ordinary child. She grew exhausted faster than she should have. Her senses sharpened and dulled unpredictably, and twice in her second trimester she felt a pulse of raw energy roll through her belly so strong it left her gasping and gripping the counter for balance. The diner's owner, A kind, weathered woman named Grace Whitfield found her doubled over near the register one afternoon and insisted on driving her to the town clinic herself. The old doctor there, a soft-spoken man named Edward Lowry, ran his tests and frowned at the results without quite understanding what he was looking at. Elevated heart rate, strange blood markers. A child, he told her, that seemed unusually strong even this early. Elena thanked him and said nothing about what she was, because there was no version of that conversation that ended safely for either of them. Grace never asked where Elena had come from, or who the father was, or why a woman clearly capable and clearly intelligent was hiding in a diner 200 miles from anywhere important. She simply gave Elena extra shifts folded gently into fewer hours, slipped her free meals when the register wasn't looking, and once, on a particularly hard night when Elena sat crying quietly in the back storage room, sat down beside her on an overturned crate, and said nothing at all, just stayed until the tears stopped. It was the closest thing to family Elena had left. The birth came on a stormy night in early spring, 3 weeks earlier than the clinic's estimate, in a hospital room lit by flickering emergency lights because the power had gone out twice already from the wind outside. Elena gripped the metal bedrail so hard she left dents in it, though no one in the room noticed in the chaos. And when the boy finally came into the world, he did not cry the way other newborns cried. He opened his eyes instead, dark and strangely alert, and looked directly at his mother's face, as if he already recognized her. Elena named him Kai, a short, simple name she had chosen months earlier for no reason she could explain, except that it felt right, felt strong, felt like a name that could carry weight later in life without breaking under it. She held him against her chest and felt, for the first time since that night in the woods, something like peace. He did not look like a secret, he looked like a promise. Word of a Alpha King's coronation traveled even to places like Millbrook, carried in scattered rumors among wolves passing through on business that had nothing to do with royal politics. Elena heard, secondhand and months late, that Damien Ashford had taken the throne in a grand ceremony, and that the Elder Council had bound him in marriage the same week to a woman named Seraphina Cole, daughter of a powerful allied pack. The alliance, people said, would secure peace along 3 contested borders for a generation. Elena listened to the story from behind the diner counter, pouring coffee with a steady hand, and felt something inside her chest quietly close like a door being shut for the last time. She had made her choice already. She had chosen Kai. She had chosen this small gray life over the impossible fantasy of standing beside a king who did not know she existed anymore. She told herself it did not hurt as much as it once had. She told herself that every single day for the next several years, and some days she almost believed it. Kai grew fast, faster than any child Elena had ever seen, walking before other children his age were crawling, speaking in full sentences before he turned 2. Grace watched him toddle around the diner storage room and laughed, calling him a little genius, never once suspecting the truth that made Elena's stomach twist every time someone commented on how unusually strong or unusually clever her son seemed to be. By the time Kai was 4, he had already broken 2 chairs simply by climbing on them the wrong way, and Elena had started teaching him, quietly and carefully, the same breathing exercises her own mother had once taught her. Control before strength, calm before power. It was the only wisdom she had to offer him, the only inheritance she could pass down from a world he was not supposed to know anything about. Some nights, after Kai fell asleep in the small bed beside hers, Elena would sit by the window and look out at the dark tree line beyond Millbrook's edge, and let herself wonder, just for a moment, what Damien was doing right now. Whether he ever thought of her, whether he had any idea, buried somewhere deep beneath crowns and councils and a wife he had never chosen, that somewhere far away, a boy with his exact eyes was growing up strong enough to one day shake the foundations of everything Damien had built. She never let the wondering last long. It was a door she had learned, slowly and painfully, to keep shut. But doors, she would come to learn, do not stay shut forever, not when the thing behind them is strong enough to want out. The first real warning came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when Kai was 5 years old and playing alone near the creek behind the diner while Elena finished her shift inside. A group of older boys from the next town over had wandered down to the water, bored and looking for trouble the way bored children sometimes do, and one of them shoved Kai hard into the mud simply because he was smaller and standing in the wrong place. Elena heard the scream from inside the kitchen, a high, furious sound that did not belong to any ordinary 5-year-old, and she dropped the plate she was holding and ran. By the time she reached the creek, the older boy who had done the shoving was on the ground 10 feet away, not hurt exactly, but stunned and staring at his own hands as if trying to understand what had thrown him there. The other boys had already scattered, shouting something about a strange gust of wind that had come out of nowhere. Kai stood alone at the water's edge, small fist still clenched, breathing hard, his eyes gone dark and strange in a way that made Elena's chest tighten with fear. She scooped him up without a word and carried him back toward the apartment, her mind racing through every possible explanation she could offer if anyone came asking questions. A gust of wind, a fallen branch, anything but the truth. That night, after Kai finally settled into an uneasy sleep, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and studied her son's face in the dim light, searching for some sign of what he was becoming. He looked so much like his father in that moment, the same set to his jaw, the same stubborn calm returning slowly after the storm had passed, that it physically hurt to look at him for too long. She realized, with a growing unease she could not shake, that Millbrook would not be able to hide him forever. A boy who could knock a bully 10 feet through the air without laying a single hand on him was not a secret that stayed small and quiet in a town of only a few thousand people. Sooner or later, someone would notice. Sooner or later, the wrong someone might come looking. Elena pulled Kai closer against her side and made a quiet, private vow to herself as the wind picked up outside the window. She did not know yet how long she could keep him safe, or how long the two of them could stay hidden from a world that had already once tried to hunt her down in the dark. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would fight for every single day of peace she could give him, for as long as her strength allowed it. She had no way of knowing that the peace she fought so hard to protect was already, quietly and irreversibly, beginning to run out. The scream came before the vows did. Somewhere in the crowded stone hall, a hidden blade slid free from beneath a guest's formal robe, and a masked figure lunged toward the raised platform where Damien Ashford stood beside his bride, Serafina Cole, only seconds from being declared husband and wife, before the entire gathered nobility of 3 allied packs. The guards shouted. Chairs scraped backward in a panic. Serafina's own bodyguard threw himself in front of her a half-second too late, and it was Damien who moved first, faster than anyone in that hall expected a groom in ceremonial robes to move, catching the attacker's wrist mid-strike and driving him hard into the stone floor before the blade ever found its target. The hall fell silent except for ragged breathing and the low growl still rumbling in Damien's chest as guards swarmed forward to drag the attacker away. Serafina stood frozen at the altar, pale and shaking, staring at the man who had just saved her life with the same calm, distant expression he wore for almost everything else. He offered her his hand to help her back to her feet. She took it. Neither of them said a word about how strange it felt. The ceremony resumed 20 minutes later, as if nothing had happened at all, because that was simply how things were done among the ruling packs. Threats were investigated later, quietly, by men whose job it was to make problems disappear. Weddings, once started, were finished. Damien said his vows in a clear, steady voice that gave no hint of the storm still moving behind his eyes. Serafina said hers with practiced grace, the daughter of a powerful pack raised from birth to understand that marriage among leaders was a contract, not a promise of the heart. When the Elder Council pronounced them bound, the hall erupted into applause, and somewhere beneath the noise, Damien felt something in his chest quietly close, the same way a door closes on a room nobody plans to enter again. He did not think of Elena in that exact moment. He had trained himself, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, not to think of her at all. But that night, alone in a private chamber while Serafina met with her own family in a separate wing of the castle, Damien stood at the window and let himself remember, just once, the sound of Elena's laugh echoing off the cabin walls, and the way she had looked at him like he was simply a man, not a king, not an alliance, not a name carved into ancient bloodline records. He closed the shutters before the memory could go any further. The following months settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, exactly like a successful royal marriage. Damien and Serafina appeared together at council meetings, hosted allied delegations, and stood side by side at public ceremonies with practiced ease. The alliance secured, exactly as planned, an uneasy peace along 3 contested borders that had bled soldiers for 2 generations before this marriage stopped the fighting cold. But behind closed doors, the marriage was a careful, quiet distance, dressed up as partnership. Damien was polite. He was fair. He never once raised his voice or treated Serafina with anything less than respect. And that, more than anything, was what began to eat away at her from the inside, because respect without warmth is its own kind of loneliness, and Serafina Cole had not married a king expecting to spend her nights in a cold, empty bed, listening to the wind outside a window while her husband stood awake somewhere down the hall, staring at nothing. She tried at first to close the distance herself. She learned his favorite foods and had the kitchens prepare them without being asked. She studied the reports he read late into the night and offered sharp, useful commentary that surprised him more than once with its precision. She was, by every reasonable measure, an excellent match, capable and intelligent, and fiercely loyal to the alliance her marriage protected. Damien noticed her effort. He even, in his own quiet way, came to respect her deeply for it. But respect was a small, careful word, and it was never quite the same thing Serafina wanted him to feel. The dream started roughly 4 months into the marriage, always the same, always beginning with the smell of pine and wood smoke, and a cabin tucked deep in the mountains, where nobody from the capital ever thought to look. In the dreams, Elena was laughing about something Damien could never quite remember when he woke, her hand resting light and warm against his chest, and every single time, just as he reached to pull her closer, the dream dissolved, and left him staring instead at the unfamiliar ceiling of a marriage bed he did not choose. He never told anyone about the dreams, not his advisors, not the pack healer who occasionally checked on his health, and certainly not Serafina, who had begun, slowly and carefully, to notice the distant look that crossed her husband's face at odd, unexplainable moments. It was a healer named Nathaniel Cross, an old friend of Damien's from before the crown, who first dared to ask the question directly. Late one evening while treating a minor training injury on Damien's shoulder, he asked, gently, whether something weighed on the king's mind that he wished to speak of. Damien answered honestly, in the careful, guarded way kings learn to answer even old friends. He said only that some choices, once made, could not be unmade, and that a man simply had to learn to carry the weight of them without complaint. Nathaniel did not push further, but he watched his old friend a little more closely after that, and he began, quietly, to wonder what exactly Damien had left behind before stepping onto that platform to marry a woman he clearly did not love. Serafina wondered the same thing, though her wondering carried a much sharper edge. She was not a foolish woman, and she had not spent her entire life among pack politics without learning to read the small, careful silences that filled a room whenever certain topics came too close to the surface. She noticed how Damien's jaw tightened whenever the topic of his time before the throne came up in conversation. She noticed the particular, careful way his advisors avoided mentioning the mountain territories where he had spent nearly 2 years before his coronation. Territories that officially held nothing of importance but somehow seemed to carry a weight none of them wanted to name aloud. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, to ask her own questions. It started small, a request to a trusted servant to review old travel logs from Damien's years before the throne, a carefully worded conversation with an elder who had once served on the council that arranged the marriage, probing gently for any rumor of complications that might have needed smoothing over before the wedding could proceed. Each answer she received only deepened her suspicion rather than settling it. Vague mentions of a mountain posting, an unusually long absence from official duties, records that seemed to have gaps exactly where she expected to find them filled. Serafina told herself she was simply protecting her position, the way any capable wife protected the alliance her marriage was built to secure. She told herself the same thing every single time the ache beneath the suspicion sharpened into something closer to jealousy over a rival she could not yet name. 2 years passed this way, the marriage holding steady on the surface while 2 very different kinds of loneliness grew quietly underneath it. Damien buried himself in the work of ruling, expanding trade agreements, settling border disputes, training the next generation of pack warriors with a discipline that earned him deep respect among even the harshest critics of his young reign. Serafina built her own quiet network of information and alliance within the court, becoming, in her own right, one of the sharpest political minds among the ruling packs. Neither of them spoke of the mountain territories again. Neither of them spoke of the strange, aching distance that sat between them at every dinner, every council meeting, every quiet night in a shared bed that somehow always felt too large for 2 people. And somewhere far beyond the reach of either of their carefully guarded questions, in a small gray town neither of them had ever heard of, a boy with Damien's exact eyes grew a little stronger, a little sharper, and a little harder to hide with every single day that passed. The clue Serafina had been searching for surfaced by pure accident, tucked inside an old travel ledger she had requested simply to cross-reference supply routes from the years before her marriage. A single line, half-faded, listed a delivery of medical supplies to a border cabin 2 years before the coronation, signed off not by any official steward but by Damien himself, in his own unmistakable handwriting. Cabins near the border did not usually require personal royal signatures for medical deliveries. Serafina sat alone in her private study long after midnight, turning the page over and over beneath candlelight, feeling something cold and certain settle into her stomach. Whatever had happened out there in the mountains, it had mattered enough to her husband that he had handled it personally, quietly, and never once mentioned it in 2 years of marriage. She did not confront him. Not yet. A woman raised among pack politics understood that information gathered too early, revealed too soon, lost most of its value. Instead, she folded the ledger page carefully into a small locked box she kept hidden beneath her writing desk, and she waited, patient as still water, for the right moment to use what she had found. That same week, tension along the eastern border finally boiled over into open conflict. A rival alpha named Victor Hale, ambitious and increasingly bold since inheriting his own smaller territory, had spent months testing the edges of Ashford land with small provoking raids, stealing livestock, burning a single watchtower, daring the young king to respond with force he could then use as an excuse to rally his own allies against the crown. Damien rode out personally to meet him, against the strong advice of nearly every advisor in his court, because he understood something they did not. A king who sent soldiers to fight his battles while he stayed safely behind castle walls would never earn the kind of loyalty that held a fractured territory together through harder years ahead. The two alphas met at the disputed borderline beneath a gray, threatening sky, each flanked by a dozen of their strongest warriors, close enough that a single wrong word could spill into open war. Victor Hale circled slowly, testing, provoking, questioning aloud in front of both gathered forces whether the young king commanded his throne through strength or through the marriage that had bought him 3 allied packs instead of 1. Damien did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the blade at his side. He simply stepped forward, alone, into the open space between the two forces, and challenged Victor Hale directly to settle the border dispute the old way, wolf against wolf. Winner takes the disputed land without another drop of blood spilled on either side. It was a dangerous gamble. Victor was younger, hungrier, and known for a vicious fighting style that had already won him 3 similar challenges against smaller rivals. But Damien had spent 2 years training with a discipline that bordered on obsession, partly to prove himself worthy of a crown he had never wanted this way, and partly, though he rarely admitted it even to himself, because exhausting his body was the only reliable way to quiet the ache that memory left behind. The fight lasted less than 4 minutes. It ended with Victor Hale pinned beneath Damien's full weight, breathing hard, staring up at a king whose calm expression never once wavered even as he delivered the final decisive blow that settled the challenge beyond any argument. Damien released him, stepped back, and offered a hand exactly the way he had once offered one to Serafina after his own wedding, an act of respect extended even to a defeated rival. Victor Hale did not take the offered hand, but he did lower his head in acknowledgement before gathering his warriors and retreating back across the border without another word. The disputed land remained Ashford territory. No further blood was spilled that week. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through every allied pack, cementing Damien's reputation as a king who led from the front, who settled disputes through strength and honor, rather than hiding behind armies and alliances alone. Serafina heard the story secondhand from her own advisors, and despite the cold folded page still locked in her private study, she felt a strange, unwilling flicker of pride at how capably her husband commanded both respect and restraint in the same breath. That night, when Damien returned to the castle bearing a fresh line of stitches along one forearm from the fight, Serafina tended to the wound herself instead of summoning the healer, working in careful silence while Damien watched her hands with quiet, grateful attention. For a brief, fragile moment, something almost like closeness passed between them, 2 people bound by duty who might, under different circumstances, have found something real in each other. Then Damien's gaze drifted, just briefly, toward the window and the dark mountains visible far beyond it, and Serafina saw it happen, saw the exact instant his mind traveled somewhere she could not follow. She finished the stitches without a word, closed the medical kit, and returned to her own chambers that night, with the locked box and its single damning page weighing heavier on her mind than it had in days. Whatever waited in those mountains, she promised herself silently, she would find it, and when she did, she intended to use it. Glass shattered across the diner floor the instant Kai's control finally broke. It happened on a Saturday morning crowded with truck drivers and a family passing through on their way to somewhere else, ordinary and loud, and entirely unremarkable, right up until the moment a clumsy waiter tripped and sent a full tray crashing down inches from where 10-year-old Kai sat finishing his breakfast before school. The sound alone would have startled anyone. For Kai, whose control over his growing strength had been slipping for months in ways Elena could no longer explain away as ordinary childhood clumsiness, the sudden crash triggered something far more dangerous than a simple flinch. The shift began before he could stop it, bones cracking audibly beneath his skin, and for one horrifying second the entire diner froze in stunned silence as a boy who had been sitting calmly with a plate of eggs collapsed forward across the table, convulsing through a transformation his body was clearly not ready to control. Chairs scraped back in panic. Someone screamed, Grace Whitfield, moving faster than a woman her age should have been able to move, threw a heavy tablecloth over the entire booth and shouted at the frightened customers to get outside immediately, insisting loudly that the boy was having a seizure and needed privacy and air. Elena reached the booth seconds later, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe, and found Kai halfway shifted, caught agonizingly between two forms, whimpering in pain and fear beneath the tablecloth Grace still held steady overhead, like a shield against a dozen frightened, curious eyes. Elena dropped to her knees beside him and did the only thing she knew to do, pressing both hands against his chest and speaking low and steady, repeating the same calming words her own mother had once used on her. Breathe slow. Find your center. You are safe. You are in control. It took nearly 3 full minutes, the longest 3 minutes of Elena's entire life, before Kai's body finally settled back into its human shape, leaving him pale, sweating, and trembling against his mother's chest, while the diner around them buzzed with confused, frightened whispers that would not stay contained for long in a town as small as Millbrook. Grace drove them home herself that afternoon, closing the diner early for the first time in 11 years, and sat with Elena at the small kitchen table long after Kai had finally cried himself into an exhausted sleep. She did not ask what she had seen. She simply reached across the table, took Elena's shaking hands in her own weathered ones, and said quietly that whatever Elena was running from, whatever she was protecting that boy from, it was clearly bigger than anything a small gray town like Millbrook could keep hidden much longer. Elena broke then, finally, after nearly 11 years of careful silence, and told Grace everything. She told her about the wolves, about the packs and their politics, about a mountain cabin and a king who did not know he had a son, about running through dark woods pregnant and terrified while hunters who might have been sent to kill her tore through the trees behind her. Grace listened without a single flicker of disbelief crossing her face, and when Elena finally finished, exhausted and raw, Grace simply squeezed her hands tighter and said that she had always known there was something remarkable about that boy, and that remarkable children needed more than one frightened mother trying to hide them from an entire world. It was Grace, in the end, who remembered an old customer from years ago, a quiet, careful man named Simon Ashworth, who used to pass through Millbrook on business trips, and had once mentioned, almost casually over coffee, some distant connection to Wolfpack territories further north. Grace had not thought much of it at the time. Now, faced with a boy who could shatter glass simply by losing control of his own fear, it seemed like the only lead worth chasing. It took nearly 2 weeks of careful, quiet phone calls before Grace tracked Simon Ashworth down to a small trading post 3 counties over, and another full week before Elena worked up the courage to actually make the drive out to meet him. She left Kai with Grace for the day, the first time she had ever trusted anyone else to watch him during an unpredictable shift risk, and drove the winding mountain roads with her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel the entire way. Simon turned out to be an older wolf, retired from active pack politics for over a decade, living a quiet life, far from the territories that had once demanded his loyalty. He listened to Elena's careful, guarded explanation of a boy struggling to control unusually strong shifts, and something shifted behind his own tired eyes almost immediately, a recognition he clearly tried and failed to hide. He asked gently whether the boy's father happened to hold any particular rank within his pack. Elena hesitated so long before answering that Simon simply nodded slowly, as if her silence alone had confirmed something significant. He told her, carefully and without pushing for names she clearly did not want to share, that a child born from especially strong bloodlines sometimes struggled far more than ordinary pups to control their first decade of shifts, precisely because the raw power inside them grew faster than a young mind could safely handle alone. What Kai needed, Simon explained, was proper training, ideally from someone connected to a real pack structure, someone who understood how to guide a young wolf through controlled shifts before an uncontrolled one caused real, lasting harm to himself or to someone standing too close when it happened. Continuing to hide him away from any pack contact at all, however well-intentioned the reasons, was quickly becoming more dangerous than whatever risk Elena was trying to protect him from in the first place. Elena left that meeting with a single name and a folded scrap of paper containing directions to a neutral gathering point where several smaller, independent packs occasionally met to trade information and resolve minor disputes without involving the larger, more politically charged territories. Simon assured her it was safe, mostly, and that a woman traveling with an unusually gifted young son would not draw nearly as much unwanted attention there as she feared. In the weeks that followed, Kai's questions about his father grew sharper and harder to deflect. He was old enough now to notice the careful way Elena changed the subject whenever he asked, old enough to notice that every other child at school seemed to have a father's name to offer, even if that father lived far away or came around only twice a year. Kai never had a name to offer at all, and it clearly weighed on him more than he let on. One evening, sitting together on the small porch behind their apartment while the last of the daylight faded over Millbrook's quiet streets, Kai asked the question directly for the first time, his voice smaller and more uncertain than Elena had heard it in years. He asked simply whether his father was a bad man, since that seemed like the only explanation that made sense for why his mother never spoke of him at all. Elena felt the question land like a physical blow, and she took a long moment before answering, choosing her words as carefully as she had ever chosen anything in her life. She told him, honestly, that his father was not a bad man at all, that he was in fact a strong and respected man who carried heavy responsibilities most people could never imagine carrying. She told him that circumstances, complicated and painful circumstances that were nobody's fault exactly, had kept them apart before his father even knew Kai existed. Kai absorbed this quietly, staring out at the darkening street, and asked only one more question that night, so soft Elena almost missed it entirely. He asked whether his father would want to know him now, if he ever found out the truth. Elena did not have an honest answer to that question yet, and admitting that to her own son, watching his small shoulders sag slightly with disappointment at her silence, hurt more than almost anything else she had endured in 11 years of careful hiding. It was that conversation, more than Simon's warning or Grace's gentle urging, that finally pushed Elena to make the drive she had been putting off for weeks. Whatever risk waited at that neutral gathering point, whatever danger came from stepping even slightly closer to a world she had fled so desperately, it could not possibly outweigh the slow, quiet damage being done to a boy growing up believing his own father might not want him at all. It took Elena another month to work up the courage to actually go. She told herself, driving toward that neutral gathering point with Kai asleep in the passenger seat beside her, that she was doing this purely for his safety, purely to find him proper guidance before his own strength became something neither of them could control. She told herself the gathering was simply a practical solution to a practical problem, nothing more. She did not let herself consider, not once during that entire drive, the small and terrifying possibility that word of a king's coronation 10 years past traveled even among these smaller, independent packs, or that the neutral gathering point Simon had directed her toward sat closer to Ashford territory than any place she had allowed herself to go since the night she fled through those dark mountain woods. She found out exactly how close the moment she stepped out of the car and saw, standing near the center of the gathering grounds surrounded by advisors and allied representatives, a tall, familiar figure she had spent 11 years trying desperately to forget. Elena's entire body went rigid, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, get back in the car, and drive away before anyone noticed her standing there frozen at the edge of the gathering grounds. But it was already too late. Kai, curious and restless after the long drive, had already slipped past her and wandered several steps closer to the crowd of gathered representatives, his sharp eyes fixed with open fascination on the tall man standing at the center of it all. Damien felt it before he saw it, a strange pull in his chest that made him turn his head mid-conversation with an allied representative, some instinct older than reason drawing his attention across the crowded grounds toward a boy standing alone near the tree line. Their eyes met for only a second before Damien's entire expression shifted, confusion giving way slowly to something far more unsettling. He knew those eyes. He had seen them every single morning of his own childhood, staring back at him from mirrors and portraits, and the memory of his own father's face. No child in this gathering should have carried that exact shade of dark gold, that particular intensity that ran through only a handful of the oldest, strongest bloodlines in the region. Damien's gaze lifted past the boy and found Elena standing frozen several yards behind him, and for one long, suspended moment, 11 years collapsed into nothing at all. He saw the same woman from that mountain cabin, older now, sharper around the eyes in the way hard years leave their mark, but unmistakably, achingly the same. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The gathered representatives around them continued their quiet business, entirely unaware that something enormous and irreversible had just shifted in the small clearing at the edge of their meeting. It was Kai who broke the silence first, tugging at the sleeve of a nearby stranger, asking with open childish curiosity whether the tall man over there was someone important, since everyone around him seemed to treat him with such careful respect. The stranger, an older representative from a smaller pack, chuckled and told the boy, without a second thought, that he was looking at Alpha King Damien Ashford himself, ruler of the largest territory in the entire region. Kai's eyes widened, and he turned immediately back toward his mother with the innocent excitement of a child who had just learned something fascinating. Entirely unaware of the storm his simple question had just set loose in both of his parents at once. Elena forced her legs to move, crossing the distance to grab Kai's hand and pull him gently but urgently back toward the car, murmuring some excuse about needing to leave immediately, that they had stayed too long already and needed to get back before dark. Kai protested, confused by his mother's sudden urgency, but something in her voice convinced him not to argue further. Damien watched them go, every instinct in his body screaming at him to follow, to demand answers, to close the distance between himself and a truth he had somehow already recognized before his mind fully caught up to it. But 11 years of careful royal discipline held him rooted in place, surrounded by advisors and allied representatives who would notice immediately if their king abandoned a diplomatic gathering to chase after a stranger and her son. He forced himself through the remainder of the gathering with a calm, composed exterior that fooled every single person around him except one. Nathaniel Cross, the healer and old friend who had known Damien since long before the crown, watched his king's carefully controlled expression throughout the rest of the afternoon, and recognized, with growing concern, the exact particular stillness Damien wore only when something had shaken him to his core. That evening, back at the castle, Damien sat alone in his private study long after the household had gone quiet, staring at nothing, replaying the boy's face over and over in his mind, until the memory blurred with certainty. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence, that dark gold eyes existed in other bloodlines too, that 11 years and a single brief glance across a crowded gathering proved nothing at all. But some part of him, the same instinctive part that had once known, without being told, that Elena carried something precious and fragile inside her the last morning he ever saw her, refused to accept the comfortable lie. He remembered now, with sudden painful clarity, the particular exhaustion in her face that final morning, the way she had held herself just slightly differently, the way he had told himself at the time it was simply the ache of an ending neither of them wanted to name aloud. He had left before dawn that morning specifically because he could not bear to watch her face while he did it. He had told himself, walking away through those same dark woods Elena would flee through only hours later, that leaving quickly and quietly was the kinder choice, sparing them both a goodbye too painful to survive. He had never once considered, in 11 years of careful royal duty, that he might have left behind far more than a woman's broken heart. Damien did not sleep at all that night. By morning, he had already summoned a trusted tracker from among his most discreet personal guard, a quiet, capable man named Adrian Voss, who had served the Ashford family for over 2 decades, and understood, better than almost anyone in the castle, when a task required absolute silence. He gave Adrian a simple, careful instruction. Find the woman and the boy from yesterday's neutral gathering. Learn everything possible about their circumstances, quietly and without alarming them in any way. Report back directly to him and no one else. Adrian did not ask questions. He had served long enough to recognize when a king's private request carried weight far beyond its simple wording, and he set out that same morning with the kind of quiet, patient thoroughness that had made him invaluable to the Ashford family for 20 years. 3 days later, he returned with a name, an address in a small town called Millbrook, and a single detail that made Damien's blood run cold the moment he heard it spoken aloud. The boy, Adrian reported carefully, had been born almost exactly 9 months after records showed the king's final departure from his mountain posting, 11 years earlier. Damien sat with that information for a long time in complete silence, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that did not match the storm raging quietly beneath it. He told Adrian, in careful, measured words, that he required one final piece of information before deciding how to proceed. He needed absolute confirmation, through whatever discreet means necessary, of exactly what he already suspected to be true. Somewhere far across the castle, in a wing she rarely visited without deliberate purpose, Serafina Cole sat at her own private desk, running her fingers slowly across the edge of a small locked box hidden beneath false papers in her lowest drawer, sensing without yet knowing exactly why, that whatever secret her husband had buried in those mountains 11 years ago was finally, inevitably, beginning to surface. The knock on Elena's apartment door came on a quiet Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the gathering, and it nearly stopped her heart before she even opened it. She had been half expecting it, dreading it, replaying that frozen moment across the clearing every single night since it happened, and still nothing could have fully prepared her for the sight of Damien Ashford standing in the narrow hallway outside her small apartment, alone, dressed plainly enough that he might have passed for any ordinary traveler if not for the unmistakable presence that seemed to fill the entire hallway around him. Kai was at Grace's for the evening, a small mercy Elena had not planned but suddenly felt grateful for beyond words. She stood frozen in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, unable to decide whether to slam it shut or simply collapse under the weight of 11 years finally catching up to her all at once. Damien spoke first, his voice quieter and rougher than she remembered. Stripped of the practiced calm he wore in public, he asked, simply, if he could come in. He said he was not there as a king. He said he had come only as a man who needed to know the truth. Elena stepped aside without a word, and he entered the small apartment slowly, taking in the modest furniture, the crayon drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator, the single small pair of boots left by the door. Every detail of an ordinary, hidden life he had never known existed. He stopped in front of a photograph on the side table, a school picture of Kai taken the previous year, and Elena watched something break quietly behind his eyes as he studied it. He asked her directly, without preamble, whether Kai was his son. Elena had rehearsed 100 different answers to that question over 11 years, careful evasions and gentle deflections designed to protect herself from exactly this moment. In the end, standing in her own small kitchen with the man she had once loved more than her own safety, she found she had no evasion left in her at all. She told him the truth, plainly and without apology, that Kai was indeed his son, born almost exactly 9 months after the morning Damien left the mountain cabin without a single word of goodbye. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if he intended to say anything at all. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly around the edges, asking why she had never told him, why she had disappeared instead of finding some way, anyway, to let him know what she carried. Something hard and long buried finally broke loose in Elena's chest, and 11 years of carefully controlled composure gave way all at once. She told him, her voice rising with a fury she had never once allowed herself to feel fully in his absence, that he had left before dawn without a single word, that guards had come hunting for her within hours of his departure, that she had run pregnant and terrified through dark mountain woods with no idea whether she was fleeing simple border enforcement or something far more deliberate. She told him that by the time she understood she was carrying his child, he was already standing at an altar marrying another woman for the sake of an alliance, and that no version of approaching him afterward had ever looked like anything other than humiliation for herself and danger for the child she was determined above everything else to protect. Damien absorbed each accusation without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every new detail, and when Elena finally finished, breathing hard, tears she refused to let fall burning at the edges of her eyes, he told her quietly that he had never known guards were sent after her at all. He told her, with a growing horror in his own voice, that he had assumed she simply chose to leave on her own, unwilling to live as a hidden secret in a life built around a crown and a marriage neither of them wanted. The revelation that he had genuinely never known about the guards, had never ordered or sanctioned any hunt against her, hung heavy in the small kitchen between them. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of deception, and found only the same raw, stunned grief she felt reflected back at her. If Damien had not sent those guards, someone else had. Someone with enough authority to dispatch royal hunters after a low-ranking wolf from a rival pack the very same morning the future king left her bed for the last time. The question of who, and why, settled between them with a weight neither of them was prepared to fully confront yet. Damien asked, more gently now, if he could meet his son. Elena hesitated, every protective instinct she had built over 11 years screaming caution. But something in his face, raw and genuinely desperate rather than commanding, finally convinced her. She told him Kai was at a friend's home nearby, and that if he truly intended to be part of his son's life, he needed to understand clearly that Kai's safety came before any political convenience, before any crown, before anything else at all. Damien agreed without hesitation, and something in the immediate, unconditional way he agreed told Elena more clearly than any words could have that this man, whatever mistakes he had made 11 years ago, genuinely meant it. They drove together to Grace's small house on the edge of town in near total silence, both of them lost in thoughts too large to voice aloud. Grace opened the door and took one look at the tall stranger standing beside Elena, and understood immediately, without needing a single word of explanation, exactly who she was looking at. Kai came bounding out from the back room at the sound of voices, stopping short the instant he saw the familiar face from the gathering standing in Grace's front hallway. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other, 11 years of separation collapsing into a single suspended silence neither of them quite knew how to fill. It was Kai who finally broke it, tilting his head with the same open curiosity he had shown at the gathering, and asking simply why the king of an entire territory was standing in Grace's living room looking, for the first time Kai had ever seen on an adult's face, completely and utterly unsure of what to say next. Damien knelt down slowly to meet the boy at eye level, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that surprised even himself. He told Kai, simply and honestly, that he had traveled a very long way to meet him, and that he hoped, more than he had hoped for almost anything in 11 years of ruling a kingdom, that Kai might eventually give him the chance to explain everything he had missed. Kai studied him for a long moment with those unmistakable dark gold eyes, and then, with the easy forgiveness only a child can offer so freely, asked if the king wanted to see the fort he had built in the backyard. Damien's composed royal expression finally cracked into something that looked, for the first time in 11 years, almost entirely like relief. Glass shattered inward through the apartment window at nearly midnight, and Elena was on her feet with Kai pulled tight against her chest before the second projectile even landed. A canister rolled across the floor, hissing thin gray smoke that smelled faintly of something bitter and chemical, nothing like ordinary fire, and every instinct in Elena's body screamed that this was no accident, and no simple break-in. She grabbed Kai's hand and bolted for the back door, coughing already as the smoke thickened faster than any natural fire ever could, and threw it open only to find two figures waiting silently in the alley beyond, faces covered, stance unmistakably trained. Elena did not hesitate. She spun back inside, dragging Kai toward the front instead, calculating in half a heartbeat that whoever had sent these people wanted this handled quietly, without witnesses, which meant the front street, however exposed, was still safer than a sealed alley with trained hunters waiting. Kai's control slipped the instant real fear took hold, his small body beginning the same dangerous half-shift Elena had fought so hard to prevent since that day in the diner, and this time she did not stop him. She let him find whatever strength his body needed, because whoever waited outside that door intended to hurt them both, and Elena would rather face down a squad of trained hunters with an angry, half-shifted 10-year-old at her side than lose him to whatever silent, deniable death these attackers had been sent to deliver. They burst through the front door into the cold night air just as three more figures closed in from the street, and for one terrifying moment, Elena believed she had made the wrong calculation, that there was no path out of this that did not end badly. Then, from the darkness beyond the streetlight, a low, furious growl rolled through the night, and Adrian Voss, the tracker Damien had sent weeks earlier, and quietly stationed nearby ever since without telling Elena directly, exploded out of the shadows in full shifted form, and tore into the nearest attacker before the man could even raise his weapon. What followed lasted less than 90 seconds, brutal and fast, Adrian moving with the discipline of 2 decades of trained service, while Elena shielded Kai's smaller frame behind her own, ready to fight if it came to that. It did not need to. Adrian left 2 attackers unconscious in the street and the others fleeing into the darkness rather than face a warrior clearly beyond their preparation, and by the time the first neighbors began cautiously opening their doors to investigate the noise, the danger had already passed. Adrian knelt beside Elena, breathing hard, and told her grimly that he had suspected something like this might happen eventually, which was exactly why the king had asked him to remain nearby, even after delivering his initial report. He told her they needed to leave Millbrook immediately, that whoever had ordered this attack clearly had resources and training that pointed towards someone deep inside the Ashford court itself, someone with far more reach than a random rival pack acting alone. Within the hour, Elena and Kai were in a car heading toward the capital under Adrian's protection, leaving behind the only ordinary life Kai had ever known. Grace, informed by a hurried phone call from the roadside, promised to handle whatever needed handling at the apartment, and told Elena firmly to worry about nothing except keeping that boy safe, that Millbrook and the diner would still be there whenever this was finally settled. Word reached Damien before dawn, and he was waiting at a private entrance to the castle grounds himself when Adrian's car finally arrived, his composed royal bearing entirely abandoned the moment he saw Kai emerge shaken but unharmed. He pulled his son into an embrace so fierce and immediate that Kai, still trembling from the night's terror, finally allowed himself to cry properly for the first time since the attack began. Damien's fury, once he learned the full details, was colder and more controlled than anything Adrian had seen from him in years of service. He did not shout, he did not rage, he simply asked, in a low-level voice, for every single detail Adrian could provide about the attackers, their equipment, and any possible trace of who had ordered them into Millbrook in the first place. The chemical compound used in the canisters, once identified by the castle's own healers, turned out to be a rare and expensive substance used almost exclusively by trained assassins working within pack politics, difficult to acquire, and nearly impossible to trace back to an ordinary source. Whoever had ordered the attack possessed both significant resources and detailed knowledge of exactly where Elena and Kai had been hiding, information that had been known, as far as Damien was aware, to only a small handful of trusted people within his own household. It was Nathaniel Cross, working quietly alongside Adrian over the following days, who first suggested the uncomfortable possibility that the leak had come from inside the castle itself, and it was Nathaniel who eventually noticed, during a routine visit to deliver medicine to Serafina's private chambers, a small locked box hidden with unusual care beneath false papers in her lowest desk drawer. He said nothing to Serafina directly. He reported what he had seen to Damien instead, carefully and without accusation, simply noting the detail as something worth investigating given everything else that had happened. Damien listened in grim silence, already suspecting, with a growing sick certainty, exactly what his wife might have discovered, and exactly how far she might have gone to protect her position once she learned the truth. He confronted Serafina that same evening in her private study, and when he demanded she open the locked box in front of him, she did not resist, meeting his gaze with a cold, unflinching pride that told him everything before she even spoke a single word. Inside, alongside the faded travel ledger page she had discovered years earlier, sat a folded note in unfamiliar handwriting, a confirmation of payment made to a group operating out of the Southern Territories, the exact group Adrian had already identified as the likely source of the assassins sent to Millbrook. Serafina did not deny it. She told him, with a bitterness 11 years in the making, that she had spent her entire marriage as a placeholder for a woman he never stopped loving, that she had built alliances and secured borders and given everything expected of a queen, only to discover, eventually, that a rival's son threatened to unravel the very foundation her marriage had been built to protect. She told him she had not ordered the attack intending murder, only intimidation severe enough to send Elena fleeing far beyond any territory that mattered to the Ashford crown, and that the attackers had clearly exceeded whatever careful instructions she believed she had given them. Whether or not that claim was true, Damien understood in that moment that whatever remained of his marriage had finally, irreversibly, come to its end. He ordered Serafina confined to her chambers under guard while the Elder Council investigated the full extent of her involvement, and he walked out of that study carrying a weight far heavier than the crown itself, the terrible knowledge that his own household had nearly cost him the son he had known for barely a few days. The alarm bells rang across the castle grounds just before sunrise, sharp and urgent, and Damien was already moving before the first guard reached his chamber door to deliver the news. Serafina's private wing had been breached from within, her guard detail overpowered not by outside attackers but by her own household staff, several of whom turned out to be loyal to her family's southern allies rather than to the crown they had sworn to serve. By the time Damien arrived, the confinement chamber stood empty, a single window forced open onto a service courtyard, and Serafina Cole was gone. Worse news followed within the hour. 3 members of the Elder Council, all closely tied to Serafina's family through decades of alliance, had also vanished overnight, along with a small contingent of soldiers loyal specifically to the southern bloodline rather than to Damien's throne. It did not take long for Damien's advisors to understand exactly what this meant. Serafina, faced with the collapse of her marriage and her position, had chosen to flee not quietly into exile but toward open confrontation, gathering whatever loyal forces remained to her family's cause before Damien's investigation could formally strip away everything she still held. Nathaniel Cross found Damien standing alone in the war room an hour later, staring at a map of the Southern Territories with an expression too still to be calm. Nathaniel asked quietly what the king intended to do. Damien answered without looking up, his voice flat and certain in a way that left no room for argument. He intended to end this before it grew into the kind of fractured civil conflict that had bled the kingdom for 2 generations, before his own coronation finally secured an uneasy peace. Elena, informed of the crisis by Adrian within hours, insisted on being brought to the castle immediately, rather than kept at a safer distance, arguing fiercely that Kai's safety depended on this conflict being resolved swiftly and completely, rather than dragging on while she and her son remained hidden targets somewhere on the periphery. Damien resisted at first, unwilling to place either of them anywhere near the danger building on the southern border. But Elena reminded him, with the same sharp determination that had once carried her safely through 11 years of hiding, that she was not a woman who waited quietly on the sidelines while others decided her family's fate. Kai, for his part, absorbed the sudden tension in the castle with the particular seriousness only a child forced to grow up too quickly could manage, asking direct, unflinching questions about what was happening, and refusing to be shielded from the truth the way most adults instinctively wanted to shield him. Damien found himself, more than once in those tense days, explaining pack politics and border conflicts to his 10-year-old son, with the same careful honesty he owed to his most trusted advisors, and something about the boy's steady, thoughtful attention reminded him powerfully of the woman who had raised him alone for over a decade. 3 days after Serafina's escape, scouts confirmed that a gathered force loyal to the Southern bloodline had assembled at the same disputed border where Damien had once faced Victor Hale in single combat, a location chosen, Damien suspected, quite deliberately by advisors who understood exactly how much symbolic weight that ground carried. Serafina herself stood among the gathered force when Damien arrived with his own contingent, flanked by council members who had cast their lot with her rather than risk losing their family standing under a king now openly raising a son born outside his royal marriage. The two sides faced each other across the same open ground where Damien had once settled a border dispute through honor rather than bloodshed, and for a long, tense moment, it seemed entirely possible that this confrontation would end in exactly the kind of open conflict neither side could afford. Serafina stepped forward alone into the space between the two forces, exactly as Damien once had, and called out that she came not seeking war but seeking a fair hearing before the full council, arguing that a king who abandoned the alliance his own marriage was built to protect, threatened the stability of every territory that alliance currently held together. It was, Damien recognized immediately, a clever political maneuver rather than an honest grievance, an attempt to frame her own actions, including the attack on Elena and Kai, as a defense of alliance stability rather than the desperate, vengeful act it truly had been. Several among the gathered Southern soldiers shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether they had been called to genuine political grievance or personal retaliation, and Damien recognized in that hesitation his best opportunity to end this without a single drop of blood spilled. He stepped forward to meet her in the open space, and rather than answering her political framing with anger, he answered it with the plain, unadorned truth. He told the entire gathered assembly, Southern soldiers and his own forces alike, exactly what had happened 11 years ago in the mountain territories, exactly how Elena had fled pregnant and alone after guards were sent to hunt her down, and exactly what Serafina had ordered done to a woman and a child who had never threatened the alliance at all, until someone tried to have them silenced through violence rather than honest confrontation. He called Elena and Kai forward from where they waited at the edge of his own assembled forces, and Kai walked out into that open ground beside his mother, with a steadiness that made more than a few hardened soldiers on both sides fall silent with something like respect. Damien knelt beside his son in front of the entire gathered assembly and declared, plainly and without a single hint of political calculation, that this boy was his blood, his heir, and his responsibility, regardless of what cost that truth carried for his own crown. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to fear the declaration alone would not be enough to turn the gathered Southern forces away from the conflict Serafina had assembled them for. Then, slowly, one of the Southern soldiers, an older warrior who had served 3 decades under different alphas, lowered his weapon and stepped back from the assembled line, stating quietly that he had not gathered here to shed blood over a queen's wounded pride, and that a king honest enough to claim his son in front of an entire assembly deserved a fair hearing rather than a battlefield. Others followed, slowly at first and then in a steady wave, until Serafina stood nearly alone at the front of a force that had come prepared for war, and found, instead, that it no longer had the stomach for one. Her expression, watching her carefully assembled advantage collapse in real time, carried a grief far deeper than simple political defeat, the raw recognition that whatever chance she once had at genuine partnership with the man standing across from her had ended long before this confrontation ever began. A hidden blade nearly ended everything before the council hearing even began. Serafina had been escorted back to the capital under guard to face formal judgment before the full Elder Council, and on the morning of the hearing, as advisors gathered in the Great Hall to prepare the chamber, one of her remaining loyalists, a young cousin from her family's southern estate, managed to slip past the outer guards disguised as household staff carrying ceremonial linens. He made it within 20 feet of the raised dais where Damien would soon sit before Adrian, ever watchful, caught the wrong angle of his stance and the telltale bulge beneath his sleeve, and tackled him hard against the stone floor seconds before the hidden blade could be drawn. The young man was disarmed and dragged away shouting that Serafina deserved better than judgment from a council stacked against her, that her family's southern bloodline had been humiliated enough, and that someone needed to make the king understand the true cost of his choices. Damien, arriving moments later to find the hall still tense with the aftermath, felt his resolve harden rather than waver. Whatever mercy he had been prepared to extend toward Serafina herself, this latest act made clear exactly how far some among her remaining loyalists were willing to go, and how little safety Elena and Kai would ever have while that loyalty remained unaddressed. The hearing convened an hour later than scheduled, delayed by the security sweep that followed the failed attack, and the Great Hall filled with representatives from every allied pact territory, all eager to witness the resolution of a scandal that had already spread across the entire region in whispered rumor. Serafina stood before the assembled council in plain formal robes, stripped of the elaborate ceremonial dress she had worn as queen, her expression composed but pale in a way that suggested the morning's failed attack had shaken her as much as anyone. The council's questioning lasted most of the day, methodical and thorough, examining the ledger page, the payment record for the Southern assassins, testimony from Adrian regarding the attack in Millbrook, and finally Serafina's own account of her reasoning. She did not deny ordering the intimidation attempt, though she maintained firmly that she had never intended actual harm to come to a child, only enough fear to send Elena fleeing beyond any territory that mattered. Whether the council believed that distinction mattered given the actual danger Kai had faced was a question that hung heavy over the remainder of the proceedings. Elena testified as well, called forward to describe in her own words exactly what had happened that night: the shattered window, the chemical smoke, the trained attackers waiting in the alley, and Kai's dangerous, fear-driven shift that had very nearly cost him control entirely. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, and something in the plain, unflinching honesty of her account seemed to move even the council members who had arrived that morning still inclined toward sympathy for Serafina's position. When Kai himself was asked, gently, whether he wished to speak, he stood before the entire assembled council, with a steadiness well beyond his years, and said simply that he did not wish anyone punished out of anger, only that he wanted to feel safe, and that he hoped whatever the council decided would make sure no other family had to run from people sent to hurt them, the way his mother had run for so many years. The hall fell utterly silent following that statement, and even several council members who had arrived prepared to argue leniency for Serafina's family found themselves unable to counter the simple, devastating clarity of a child's plain request for safety. The council's ruling, delivered late that evening after hours of private deliberation, formally annulled the marriage between Damien and Serafina on grounds of treason against the crown, stripped Serafina of her royal title, and sentenced her to permanent exile from Ashford territory under strict conditions, monitored by neutral allied pacts. Her family's southern estate retained its lands and standing, a political compromise designed to prevent the kind of open conflict that had nearly erupted at the border days earlier. But the direct line of succession through Serafina's marriage was formally and permanently severed. Serafina received the ruling with quiet, exhausted composure, offering no further argument or plea. Before being escorted from the hall, she turned once toward Damien, and for a brief moment something almost like genuine regret crossed her expression, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that different choices at different moments might have written this ending very differently for both of them. She said only that she hoped, in time, he found in that boy and his mother the kind of peace their marriage had never managed to hold, and then she was gone, escorted from the capital under guard, toward a future far removed from the throne she had once shared. Damien remained in the great hall long after the council dispersed, standing alone beneath the high stone ceiling that had witnessed his coronation, his wedding, and now the formal end of both in a single exhausting day. Elena found him there eventually, Kai having finally fallen asleep in a side chamber after the long, tense day, and she crossed the empty hall to stand quietly beside him without needing to say anything at all. Damien broke the silence first, telling her quietly that whatever came next, whatever political complications still needed sorting through in the weeks ahead, he intended for the first time in 11 years to build a life around choices he actually wanted, rather than choices duty demanded of him. Elena, studying his face in the dim evening light filtering through the hall's high windows, found herself, cautiously and for the first time since that final morning in the mountain cabin, allowing herself to believe he meant it completely. Word of the scandal reached Victor Hale within days, carried swiftly by messengers eager to curry favor with any alpha who might benefit from Ashford instability, and he wasted no time deciding how to use it. Believing a king freshly stripped of his marriage alliance and publicly entangled in scandal would be too distracted to defend his borders properly, Victor gathered a larger force than before and struck at the eastern border in the dead of night, burning 2 grain storehouses and driving off a herd of livestock before Ashford patrols could fully respond. Damien received the report before sunrise, and this time there was no hesitation in his response at all. He rode out within the hour, bringing Adrian and a full contingent of his strongest warriors, and found Victor Hale waiting at the same disputed ground yet again, clearly expecting a shaken, distracted king, rather than the composed, focused leader who actually arrived to meet him. Victor opened with the same taunting confidence he had shown years earlier, suggesting loudly that a king who could not even hold his own marriage together had no business holding an entire territory. and that perhaps it was time for stronger blood to take charge of these lands before further embarrassment weakened the alliance for everyone involved. Damien let him finish, unbothered, and then responded with a calm that unsettled Victor far more than any show of anger could have. He told Victor plainly that he had spent the last several weeks confronting exactly the kind of manipulation and deceit Victor was now attempting, and that he had emerged from it not weaker but considerably less patient with lesser threats, testing his borders for cheap political advantage. He challenged Victor to the same single combat terms as before. Winner takes the disputed grain lands without further raids, but this time added a condition of his own. If Victor lost, his own territory would fall under formal Ashford protection, ending his independent raiding once and for all. Victor, cornered by his own earlier taunts in front of his gathered warriors, had little choice but to accept. The fight that followed was shorter and more decisive than their first encounter years earlier, Damien moving with a focused, controlled fury that channeled every ounce of frustration from the preceding weeks into something devastatingly effective. Victor Hale found himself pinned within minutes, and this time, faced with the formal terms of defeat, he accepted the Ashford Protection Agreement, with considerably more humility than his earlier bravado had suggested he possessed. The eastern border settled into a far more stable arrangement within days, Victor's smaller territory folding formally under Ashford protection, in exchange for continued local governance, an outcome that strengthened Damien's overall position considerably more than the scandal had weakened it. Word spread quickly across the Allied territories that the young king, far from being destabilized by recent events, had emerged from them stronger and more decisive than ever, a reputation that did more to secure his throne than any careful political alliance ever could have. Back at the capital, Elena and Kai settled slowly into an entirely new kind of life, one neither of them had ever imagined possible during those long years hiding in Millbrook. Kai began formal training under a patient, experienced pack instructor, finally learning the proper techniques to control his growing strength that Elena alone had never been equipped to teach him. Within months, the uncontrolled shifts that had once threatened to expose him entirely became a thing of the past, replaced by the steady, disciplined control of a young wolf, finally given proper guidance. Grace Whitfield, informed of the full truth and invited to visit the capital for herself, arrived skeptical and left thoroughly charmed, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that she had always known there was something remarkable about that boy and his mother, and that she fully intended to visit often enough to make sure neither of them ever forgot the people who had helped them through the hardest years. Elena found her own place within the castle slowly and carefully, wary at first of court politics she had spent 11 years avoiding entirely, but gradually earning genuine respect among advisors and allied representatives who recognized, once they came to know her, the same sharp intelligence and quiet strength that had carried her safely through more than a decade of hiding alone. Nathaniel Cross became something of a friend to her, and even several council members who had initially expressed reservations about the scandal's political complications found themselves, over time, genuinely impressed by how steadily she carried herself through a world that had once tried very hard to erase her entirely. Kai thrived beyond anything Elena had dared hope for during those long, frightened years in Millbrook. He grew close with his father quickly, the two of them spending long hours together in training sessions and quiet evenings where Damien, determined to make up for 11 lost years in whatever time remained, taught his son everything from proper pack history to simple things like how to skip stones across the castle's ornamental pond, small ordinary moments that mattered more to both of them than any formal ceremony ever could. Nearly a year after the council hearing, with the eastern border secured, the Southern Alliance carefully rebuilt through new and more equitable terms, and Kai's training progressing steadily under his instructor's patient guidance, Damien found himself standing once again at the same castle window where he had once watched dark mountains, and let himself remember a woman he believed he had lost forever. This time, when he looked out at those same distant peaks, Elena stood beside him, and the ache that memory once carried had finally, slowly, begun to heal into something that felt, for the first time in over a decade, genuinely like peace. The council chamber felt tense and quiet the moment Damien rose to formally request Kai's recognition as his legitimate heir, and for several long minutes it seemed entirely possible that even after everything already survived, this final vote might fail. Several older council members, still uneasy about a bloodline claim built outside a sanctioned marriage, argued cautiously that formal heir status carried implications far beyond a father's personal wishes, implications that touched every allied territory bound by generations of careful succession law. Elena sat rigid in the gallery above the chamber floor, Kai's hand held tightly in her own, watching the debate unfold with a fear she had not expected to feel again after everything else they had already survived together. She had faced hunters in dark woods and assassins with chemical smoke and a queen's cold, calculated retaliation, and yet somehow this quiet, procedural council debate felt like the most terrifying threat of all, because it was the one danger neither strength nor courage could fight directly. It was, unexpectedly, one of the older council members who had originally sided closest with Seraphina's family who finally turned the tide, rising slowly to remind the chamber that he had personally witnessed Kai's plain, unflinching testimony during the earlier hearing. A boy who asked for nothing but safety and offered no anger even toward those who had tried to harm him. He argued that a bloodline strong enough to produce such character deserved recognition regardless of the complicated circumstances of its origin, and that continued denial served only old pride rather than the kingdom's genuine interests. The vote, when it finally came, passed with a margin comfortable enough to settle any lingering challenge to Kai's status. Formal recognition was granted that same afternoon, naming Kai Ashford, for the first time in official record, heir to the Ashford throne and territories, with Elena granted full recognized standing within the royal household regardless of the marriage that had never taken place between them. That evening, away from council chambers and formal ceremony, Damien found Elena alone on the same castle balcony where he had once stood remembering her during the loneliest years of his marriage, and this time there was no memory standing between them at all, only the woman herself, real and present and finally, fully safe. He told her, plainly and without the careful political language he had used all afternoon before the council, that he did not want simply to share a household or a formal arrangement built around Kai's status. He told her he wanted, if she would still have him after everything his own household had put her through, to build the life together that 11 years of fear and distance had stolen from both of them. Elena studied his face for a long moment beneath the evening stars, remembering the woods she had run through pregnant and terrified, the diner counters she had wiped clean for years while raising a son alone, the locked door she had kept carefully shut around every memory of this man for over a decade. She thought of Grace's steady kindness, of Simon's careful guidance, of Adrian's fierce protection, of every small mercy that had carried her and Kai safely to this exact moment, and she found, finally, that the answer she gave required no hesitation at all. They were married the following spring in a ceremony far smaller and far warmer than the grand political spectacle that had once bound Damien to Seraphina, attended by Grace Whitfield, who cried through most of the vows, by Nathaniel Cross and Adrian Voss standing proudly among Damien's closest friends, and by Kai himself, who stood beside his father as the king's officially recognized heir, beaming with a happiness that needed no formal speech to explain. Victor Hale, of all people, sent formal congratulations along with a modest gift, a gesture that surprised nearly everyone in attendance except Damien himself, who understood by then that even old rivals sometimes found genuine respect once tested honestly on equal ground. In the years that followed, Kai grew into exactly the kind of leader his father had once hoped to become, before duty and politics complicated everything. Strong and disciplined, but also, thanks to Elena's steady influence, deeply thoughtful about the people his choices would eventually affect. He remembered Millbrook fondly, visiting often enough that Grace's diner became something of a favorite retreat for the young heir, whenever castle life grew too heavy. And he never once forgot the ordinary, difficult years his mother had carried alone to keep him safe before any of them knew the truth of who he really was. Elena, for her part, became known throughout the Allied territories not simply as the king's wife, but as a formidable presence in her own right, respected for the same quiet strength and sharp intelligence that had once helped a frightened pregnant woman survive 11 years hidden from the very world she eventually returned to reshape. She never forgot the fear of that final night fleeing through dark mountain woods, but she no longer let it define the life she had built afterward. And Damien, standing years later at that same castle window overlooking the mountains where everything had once begun, no longer saw only the ghost of a love he believed he had lost forever. He saw, instead, the family he had built from the wreckage of every mistake and every painful year apart, proof that even a king who once let duty carry him away from the person who mattered most could, given enough time and enough courage, find his way back to exactly where he was always meant to be.